our next storyteller, my relationship with Mike here goes back. I'll explain that a little bit later on. But Mike Vax, what do you say about Mike Vax? For those of you who know him, you can ignore what I'm going to say. Originally from Oakland, California, and now makes Quad City his home. He is a band leader of the Prescott Jazz All-Stars. He's had a 50-year-plus career performing with jazz greatest names throughout the decades: Glenn Miller, Freddie Hubbard, Jimmy Dorsey, Moore, just you name it, he's been there. His love of jazz has taken him all over the U.S. and across the globe, providing clinics for young musicians, learning classical and jazz music. Like I said, Mike and the relationship here, I'll talk a minute or two about after he comes up here and tells you a story about life.
Well, first of all, it's a written rule that once you pass 80, you can use the stool. So this is interesting because when Sturgis was telling his semi-truthful stories, I thought of a great title for my story, which is probably "Truth is Stranger Than Fiction." And I don't know how many of you believe in fate, or how many of you believe in something that's supposed to happen. But when I was a very, very young person in the 40s, I don't know if there's not too many people who are going to remember this. We used to watch the radio before TV. After dinner at my grandparents' house, big bands came on, and the children were told, you do not talk, you listen. So I became enamored with big band music at a very, very young age. The other thing is that my grandfather on my dad's side was an opera fan, and I don't know how many of you remember that years ago, Texaco used to sponsor the Metropolitan Opera, so that's every Saturday afternoon, and they would do a whole opera. So by the time I was 7 or 8 years old, I would sit all afternoon with my grandfather on Saturday and hear a whole opera, and I fell in love with opera music. But I just had this feeling like this big band stuff is just the most amazing music. And so in my school, nowadays they call them recorders. We used to call them song flutes. And in my grammar school, back when California had music in the schools, we had a 100-piece orchestra in my grammar school. And in the 3rd grade, you got your song flute. Mrs. Aldrich was the orchestra teacher, I'll never forget. And so you got your song flute, and then she'd see from the 3rd grade who was doing better. So in the 4th grade, you might be able to audition for the orchestra. Most of the time, the young people were in the 5th grade when they got into it. So she handed out the song flutes. I just got completely turned on with this thing, and I started working with it on my own, you know. And about, I don't know, 5 or 6 weeks into that first semester, I went to Mrs. Aldridge and I said, what do you want me to do next? And she said, next week's lesson. I said, but I know the whole book. And she said, so I put this stuff at the end of the book for her. Years ago, she told me that she talked to one of the teachers and said, what the hell am I going to do with this kid? So in the high 3rd grade, she put me in the orchestra. Well, we had no money, and all the instruments in school were given out already. She found this beat-up old cornet, and she put it in my hand. So a lot of times the kids will ask me in my workshops, why did you pick trumpet? And I said, I didn't, it picked me. So I got this cornet, fell in love with it. It wasn't too long before my mom would have to force me to stop playing so I could do my homework, you know. And so I kept going with this thing all the time, listening to big band music. And as Stephen said, I've been very lucky because from that, I've toured with Jim Dorsey, Harry James, and Glenn Miller bands. And of course, Stan Kenton was the band I was in the most, and now I lead the Stan Kenton Legacy Orchestra. And so, oh, by the way, a sidelight, there's an old saying with musicians for people who had been on the road a bunch, were called road rats. And I can tell you, up until COVID, I was on the road for 54 years, and I averaged at least 6 months a year, every one of those 54 years on the road. I have a very understanding wife who had a good career. But something about hearing Stan Kenton, I heard that band and I said, no, this is different, as a lot of people who heard the Kenton band for the first time. And I said, I fell in love with his band. So 1956, do any of you remember the Capitol Record Club? A few. You became a member of the club, and then every month you got a thing, and if you didn't say anything, they'd send you the record, whether you wanted it or not that month. Or you just put it in there and say, I want this record. So I started getting Stan Kenton records in 1956. The first one was Kenton and Hi-Fi. And just had a love affair with his band. 1960, a bunch of my friends in the dance band at my high school saved our money, and we took dates, and we bought tickets to see Stan Kenton's Roadshow, which was Stan Kenton, June Christie, and the Four Freshmen at the Oakland Auditorium Theater. And it's sort of funny because after that, we all went out to get a bite to eat. And I said to the kids, I said, I'm going to play on that band someday. And so then April of that year, a very famous trumpet player, Don Jacoby, came to our high school to do a workshop and a concert. And he found out that I was a Kenton fan. And he said, kid, you got to come to this Stan Kenton camp this summer. I knew nothing about it because it had only been one in 1959. I went in 1960. And so I said, well, I don't know anything about that. And he said, well, I'll have him send you stuff. So they sent me all this information. And again, we just didn't really have the money to get all the way back to Bloomington, Indiana, to Indiana University. And I called up Don Jacoby, who was a real curmudgeon. And I said, Mr. Jacoby, I can't afford to go. I don't have the money for the camp. And I said, just get there, kid. My uncle bought me a train ticket from Oakland to Indiana. And that was my first time really away from home, on the train by myself. So I get to the camp. Connie Condoli, famous trumpet player, Jimmy Maxwell, famous trumpet player. I auditioned, and I don't remember the audition. I was so scared. I just remember that Don Jacoby couldn't go that summer because he had a gum infection. So he calls Connie Condoli and says, I want you to look out for my kid. So I walk in and Connie said, oh, you're Jake's kid, okay. That's all I remember, the audition. And there were about 14 bands, and I was one of the youngest there. And I made, I think, lead trumpet in about the third band. But Stan Kenton needed a fourth trumpet player in his band, and they put me in the band. So at 17, I played for Stan Kenton. At the end of that 2 weeks, I went up to Stan and I said, Mr. Kenton, I'm going to play in your band someday. And what he said really changed my life. He said, if you want to bad enough, you probably will. Well, you know what I heard? Stan Kenton said I could play in his band. So it became my lifelong dream. So I went 5 years to University of Pacific to the conservatory there, and I got a degree in classical performance, because that's what I had signed up for. But knowing I really wanted to play on Stan Kenton's band. Then I went through 4 years in the Navy Show Band, which was a great band. It was before the Navy Commodores. It was the jazz group, and we toured South America every year for the State Department. It was an amazing band. And then at the end of that, I got, after 3 trips to South America, and by the way, I should say that during those trips, that's when the communists were taking over in South America. They did not want this band playing. We were big stars down there. So the communists kept trying to stop us. And one time our bus blew up outside while we were doing a concert. They timed it wrong, I guess. One time our bus was ambushed going through the mountains in Chile. Another time we played an outdoor concert at Lake Titicaca in Bolivia. The day after Che Guevara was killed, and they were still fighting. So we were one of the only bands in the history of the United States to be awarded the Meritorious Unit Citation, which is a battle medal. But so after 3 trips, I said, I don't want to make another trip. So there was nobody at Treasure Island in San Francisco, and I'm from the Bay Area. So I took that job. And I was playing in all these different rehearsal bands in San Francisco and stuff. And one of the guys that was in the Kent band, the lead trumpet player before me, heard me play in San Francisco. So they brought me to Los Angeles to audition for the band. So this was April of 1970. I auditioned for the band, and they said, "You did great. We have other people who have to audition. I mean, don't call us, we'll call you, But sure enough, about a week later, I get a call from Dick Shearer, the road manager. "Okay, we'd like you to join the band, and we leave on tour May 2nd. This is 1970. My heart sank. I didn't get out of the Navy till the fall. I hadn't even thought about that. So, again, the truth is stranger than fiction. Stan gets on the phone and he says, "We'd really like to have you in the band. Let me make a couple of phone calls." To this day, I don't know who he called, but I was out of the Navy May 1st. And I joined the band May 2nd and spent 2.5 years. And I was just hired as the 3rd trumpet player. First trumpet player got sick. They put me on first trumpet. The day before, we did Stan's first album on his own label, which was live at Redlands University. So I took over lead trumpet the day before the recording session and had to sight read the lead trumpet parts on the recording session in front of 1,000 people for 3 minutes. And then eventually he made me road manager because he knew that I knew the music business. And then, interesting thing, because this is a life story. I mean, it just goes on and on. So, 1991, there was a college in California wanted to do a big deal about the 50th anniversary of Stan Kenton's band. So they called me and said, "Would you put a bunch of the alumni together and play for our festival?" I said, "Wow, that'd be a great idea." Now, one thing I must tell you, in Stan's will, it said there will be no Stan Kenton Orchestra after my death. Because he hated nostalgia, and he figured that if money people got a hold of the band, they'd be playing the hits of the 40s like the Glenn Miller Band. He didn't want that. So there hadn't been a Kenton Orchestra since 1968. And 78, I'm sorry. So this is 1991. I put the band together. Everybody says, "Oh, this is so great. You've got to keep this going." What do I do? I'm not supposed to. So anyway, I started a band, and it was the Mike Vax band featuring alumni of the Stan Kenton Orchestra. Way too long a name. And we started touring and made a couple of CDs. And the family contacted me, and they said, "What you're doing, Stan would really appreciate the way you're doing it, because you're doing all these workshops for kids, you're performing new music all the time, you're not doing nostalgia, only playing the hits of the 40s. So they said, "You got to keep this going." So the family says, why don't you, we'll give you permission, we'll call it Stan Kenton Orchestra. And I said, no, he's not here. It can't be the Stan Kenton Orchestra. So we came up with the Stan Kenton Alumni Band, and then later on it was changed to the Stan Kenton Legacy Orchestra. And I've been leading that band now for 32 years. And we tour every year, except for COVID. And it started out, the band started out with, it's 18, and it started out with 16 of the 18 had played with Stan when he was alive. But, you know, the years pass, and some people pass away, and some people get a little bit old for traveling. But there's still 8 of us who played with Stan Kenton when he was alive that are in the band. And we'll probably be touring again this fall. But, you know, it's one of those things where you talk about a life story. That little kid listening to big bands in the 40s, I had no idea, you know? And so basically, my life's work has been carrying on Stan Kenton's work. And it really has been a life story. So.